Welcome to our study of Daniel, session 2. We finished up with Daniel chapter 1 and verse 8. Now let's read verses 9 and 10 and discuss those. Now God granted Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the commander of the officials. And the commander of the officials said to Daniel, I am afraid of my lord the king, who has appointed your food and your drink. For why should he see your faces looking more haggard than the youths who are your own age? Then you would make me forfeit my head to the king. Well, in these two verses, we see that by the providence of God, Daniel was well liked by the prince of the eunuchs. Daniel would later be elevated to be ruler over the whole province of Babylon near the end of chapter 2. Notice also that we have a like example of what is happening to Daniel in Joseph that we've mentioned earlier in our lectures, in the first session, that is, of Daniel. Back in Genesis chapter 39, Joseph is in prison, but later he will be elevated to prime minister of Egypt, second only to Pharaoh. We can also see this same type of thing in the book of Esther, when Esther is elevated by the providence of God, even though the name God is not even mentioned in that book. The principle of providence, as stated by Mordecai, is who knows that you have come to the kingdom, that you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. That is, Esther had been made queen. She's a Jewish girl, Jewish young lady who is brought before the king to be considered to be his new wife. He loves her more than the rest, so she is given an opportunity then to save her people. So again, people of God being elevated to positions of influence and power and authority. This is what's happening in Daniel, and it has happened before. And as we've seen and stated in our earlier lecture, God is still working and ruling in kingdoms of men, and I'm confident of the fact that God puts into power those that He wants. Again, for good or ill, whether it be to bless a people or to punish a people. So, in each of these instances that we've named, Daniel, Esther, Joseph, Jehovah God used His children in the affairs of foreign Gentile governments to accomplish His purposes. Now, as we noticed in our reading, Ashpenaz, the prince of the eunuchs, was afraid of what the king might do if he learned that Daniel refused to eat and drink what the king had ordered or designated. Actually, the prince of the eunuchs was concerned about his own head, his own life. When we later see Nebuchadnezzar display his ruthless character when his orders are not followed, then we understand this man's concern and predicament. Now let's go further into this by reading verses 11 through 16. But Daniel said to the overseer, whom the commander of the officials had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days, and let us be given some vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance be observed in your presence, and the appearance of the youths who are eating the king's choice food, and deal with your servants according to what you see. So he listened to them in this matter and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, their appearance seemed better, and they were fatter than all the youths who had been eating the king's choice food. So the overseer continued to withhold their choice food and the wine they were to drink, and kept giving them vegetables. Well, Daniel uh, requested that he be given uh, these things, him and his three friends, his three companions, to drink water and to eat vegetables for a 10-day trial period. Well, the result of this 10-day trial, as we have seen, the young Hebrew men looked better, healthier than those that ate and drank the king's food. Now, of what did the king's diet consist that has has caused Daniel to not want to drink or eat of those things provided? Well, we're not sure. We're not told. It's possible that the meats that were being provided were unclean meats, pork and other things that had been forbidden by the law of Moses. That's one possible explanation. The one thing that's interesting is that in my years of being on this earth, I have run across at least 2 or 3 times something known as the Daniel diet, and basically it's a eat only vegetables, only raw vegetables, like is being done here by Daniel, and I'm sure there are health benefits to that. But the fact is that now that we're under the new covenant, all things have been declared clean by God. If you go to the book of Acts, in Acts chapter 10, I believe it is, we have Peter being given a vision and told to arise. He's told, arise, Peter, kill and eat. But there were all manners of animals in this vision, both clean and unclean, and or actually, I guess, unclean animals. So Peter says, "Not so, Lord. I've never eaten any unclean thing, and I'm not going to start now." He evidently thinks it's a test to see if he will do that. And God says, "Do not call unclean what I have cleansed." So at that point, God makes all foods clean. And there are other passages in the New Testament that deal with that, but there's no prohibition for a person who wants to follow God to abstain from any meats or foods today simply because of uncleanness. There are some foods like alcohol that I refrain from based on what I believe the Bible teaches. Other people disagree with what I've said. I believe I have good biblical argument for a Christian never to touch alcohol. But again, people that I love and respect have disagreed, and I'm not going to force my understanding upon others. But I believe that based on my study of the Scriptures, I believe it's a sin to take an alcoholic drink. And I think I can prove that, but this is not the place for it or the time. But we see Daniel being tested, or his diet being tested by the eunuch, and it turns out to be the right thing, both for his health and I believe for what God had commanded. Now let's read verses 17 through 20. As for these four youths, God gave them knowledge and intelligence in every branch of literature and wisdom. Daniel even understood all kinds of visions and dreams. Then at the end of the days which the king had specified for presenting them, the commander of the officials presented them before Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and out of them all not one was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's personal service. As for every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king consulted them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and conjurers who were in all his realm. In these verses, we see that Jehovah God continues to bless the four young Hebrew men, giving them knowledge and skill in all learning. Some translations say in all literature, as I think we've read here in the New American Standard. In all literature, wisdom, and understanding. In fact, God blessed them to such a degree that when they appeared before Nebuchadnezzar, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers that were all in all his realm. It's also especially noted that Daniel had understanding in visions and dreams. This reminds us of Joseph's power to interpret dreams back in the latter part of Genesis. And such revelation to Daniel in helping him interpret visions and dreams would be a great part of his work, as we will see throughout the book. Now, there's one fact that we must not miss in this chapter, and that is that the four young Hebrew men refused to compromise. They stood up for the way of righteousness, and God blessed and rewarded them for it. Now, this brings up a question. Does God, it's obvious that this is what happened, but does God work that way in every single case, in every single situation? There are some today who are preaching and teaching what would be called the health and wellness gospel. That is to say, if you obey God, you're going to be healthy, and you're going to be wealthy. If you do what God says, you're going to have good health, and you're going to be rich. Well, that doesn't always work that way. There are a lot of factors that go into what God allows in each person's life, or what God brings to pass in each person's life. It may be that God knows that if you had a lot of money, you would be foolish with it, that you wouldn't put Him first. So He doesn't give you any money. Or He gives you enough to survive on, and that's about it. What about the person who has been faithful for dozens and dozens of years, decades, and they end up with cancer, and it takes their life? Does that mean that they're no longer faithful to God because they've been stricken with cancer? Whether it be God doing it or not. We to stand back and say, well, that's God doing that. No, we can't say that. Even Paul, when he speaks in the book of Philemon about Onesimus being in Rome with the opportunity to hear the gospel, and then in repentance to return to his master Philemon. Even Paul, the inspired apostle, said, perhaps Onesimus was in Rome for this purpose. Perhaps, maybe, possibly. So, so even the inspired apostle, when speaking of the providence of God, he does not speak with total confidence in the idea that this particular situation was God's providence. He says perhaps. He says maybe, possibly. So that's about all we can say today. When someone is blessed, well, that's possibly God doing that. When someone is cursed, sick, has tragedy in their life, possibly, maybe, God is causing that or allowing that. Let's carry this through to its logical conclusion. The person or persons who are in the world today who have nothing to do with God, who deny God even exists, they put him down at every opportunity that they can. They ridicule Christians, on and on and on, but yet they're a billionaire. Is that the blessing of God? Or is that a situation where they followed good biblical financial principles, financial principles that are found in the Bible, but also people outside the Bible know them? Is it a case where they followed good, sound financial principles and made a bunch of money? My point again is that just because somebody's having it good in life doesn't mean that it's the blessing or reward of God. Just because somebody's having it bad in life doesn't mean it's the curse or punishment of God. As Solomon said in Ecclesiastes, time and chance happens to them all. So it could be, any number of things. So the only way that we can describe these things is perhaps, maybe, God is doing this. The only way that we could know 100% for sure that God is doing these things or is blessing this person or punishing that person or whatever is for God to reach down and say, this is my work. That's what he did in the scriptures. But the revelation of God has ceased. It's finished. It's done. God is no longer reaching into history and telling someone, I've done this. I'm the one who brought this nation down. I'm the one who caused the United States and other nations to go into Germany and destroy Germany and punish Hitler and or Mussolini or Hirohito in Japan. All we can say is perhaps. That's the work of God, to bring those nations down, to punish the evil that was being done there. I believe God, as I've said earlier, is still working in the nations today. But for me to say that this particular event is absolutely 100% for sure the work of God, I can't say that. You can't say that, because again, it would take a revelation of God to say, this is what I did, this is how I did it, on and on. All right. I don't want to beat a dead horse, but that's, if you have any questions about that, feel free to contact me. Verse 21 of chapter 1 says, and Daniel continued until the first year of Cyrus the king. Now, this chapter shows us Daniel in the days of Nebuchadnezzar, the mighty king of Babylon. And this last verse also lets us know that Daniel lived even to the time of the fall of Babylonian Empire and the beginning of the Medo-Persian Empire. Thus, Daniel was in Babylon for the entire 70 years of the exile and captivity. Not only did Daniel live to that time, but he was still prophesying at that time. We'll see that in chapter 10. It could be that if Daniel was, let's say, 15 to 20, somewhere along in there when he was taken into captivity, then at least at the time of Cyrus, the first year of Cyrus the king, he would have been 85 to 90. 70 whole years. Now, again, I believe we're going to see Darius in this book, and Darius reigned after Cyrus. So if Daniel is alive during the time of Darius, then he could be pushing 90, 95, 100, depending on how long he worked and lived into the time of Darius. One final point here about verse 21 is we see, if we go back to Isaiah 44, verse 28, through Isaiah 45 and verse 2, we read that long before Cyrus's birth, God, through the prophet Isaiah, had spoken about what Cyrus would do in releasing his people from captivity. And in fact, in that passage in Isaiah, he calls Cyrus by name. Now, some people look at the book of Daniel, and they deny that it could have been written. They look at the book of Isaiah, and they deny that it could have been written in the time of Isaiah because of this very fact and other prophecies that are made in the book of Isaiah. They say that since Cyrus is named here, they say that it had to have been written after, at least this part of Isaiah, had to have been written after the time of Isaiah. It had to have been written after Cyrus was born, after Cyrus had become king, after Cyrus had let God's people go from captivity. And therefore, they deny the inspiration of Scripture. And the reason they do that is because they deny miracles at all. They deny that miracles have ever happened. And we're not talking about they deny miracles in this day and time. They deny miracles in all times. And therefore, when they see prophecies like this, they want to date the books much later in time, and therefore deny God's inspiration of them. So we note this here, Isaiah's prophecy of Cyrus, because Isaiah is named here in chapter 1 of verse 21, and again we'll see him later in this book. Another point here is that in Ezra chapter 1, we read that Cyrus gave a decree by which all Jews that wanted to could return to their homeland to rebuild the temple and so forth. And that's recorded in Ezra chapter 1 and other passages. Now, this brings us to chapter 2. First, let's give a kind of an overview of this chapter. In the first 7 verses, we're going to see Nebuchadnezzar's forgotten dream. And then in verses 8 through 13, we're going to see Nebuchadnezzar is furious, and in his anger, he issues a decree to kill all the wise men of his kingdom. Well, in verses 14 through 16, Daniel hears of this, and he makes a plea to Nebuchadnezzar to give him time. In verses 17 through 23, Daniel's plea to God concerning God revealing the dream and the interpretation to him, and we see him praising God in that passage, along with his plea to God for revelation. Again, verses 17 to 23. In verses 24 to 30, we're going to see Daniel's explanation to Nebuchadnezzar that the Lord God would reveal the dream's meaning. And then we have in verses 31 to 45 him relating the dream and explaining it. And finally, in verses 46 to 49, we're going to see Daniel and his 3 friends promoted in the kingdom because of these events. All right, let's go to chapter 2 and start with verse 1. He says, "Now in the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, and his spirit was troubled, and his sleep left him." We see this is again the second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. This would have been somewhere around 602, maybe 603, 604. This would be the second year of his reigning alone, according to Adam Clarke, because he was king 2 years before his father's death. Therefore, what we're saying is that Nebuchadnezzar had a co-regency, which we haven't mentioned up to this point. He was co-king, or he was co-reigning with his father for 2 years prior to his father's death, and then in 605 he goes to Babylon to be crowned king, and that would be king by himself after his father's death. We say, well, he was already king. Yeah, but he was king with his father. So there would have been another ceremony. There would have been another time, that David, that Nebuchadnezzar would be king by himself. Now, this was therefore, if that's the case, that this is the second year of his reigning alone, and this was therefore the 5th year of his reign and the 4th year of the captivity of Daniel. Again, according to Adam Clarke. There may be a year or two difference there somehow again, because of the dating systems that were used. Now, the events of this chapter and the king's dreams remind us again of Joseph. Back in Genesis chapter 41, we have Pharaoh having dreams that that were foretelling God-given interpretation of those dreams, were foretelling the drought and the years of plenty, the 7 years of plenty and the 7 years of drought. And Pharaoh eventually soon after that, he put Joseph in charge of that process. So again, the events of this chapter and the king's dreams remind us of that event. Notice also these particular notable things that came out of Nebuchadnezzar's dream, as we will get into it and give in more detail. It made known how the Lord would set up a kingdom that should never be destroyed, that would never be destroyed. And it also provided for the promotion of Daniel and his friends to a high position in government, which we will see near the end of the chapter, as we've said. Now, in chapter 2, verses 2 and 3, we read this. Then the king gave orders to call in the magicians, the conjurers, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans to tell the king his dreams. So they came in and stood before the king. Then the king said to them, "I had a dream, and my spirit is anxious to understand the dream." Now, the magicians sought by means of prescribed words and strange actions to influence people, whether kings or other authorities or audiences. In general, magicians had some crude knowledge of the laws of nature which were not accessible to the people in general. And we say this to speak to the idea of the type of people that the king had advising him. When we talk about the magicians, these would have been people that um, that that basically in many ways just came up with things based on their understanding of what the king wanted to hear, uh, or if they wanted to turn the king's mind to a different path of thinking, a different way of thinking, then they could influence the king one way or another. Uh, I guess the main thing I want to say about these magicians is that if we want to say that they had magical powers, then we would uh, then we would be wrong. Magic, in the sense of true powers of the type that some people through history claim to have, and even today, when we say magicians, we would also include uh, prophets and prophetesses. We would include fortune tellers. We would include palm readers. Those who claim to have some power over uh, certain things and the realm of the dead and the spirit world and so forth. They're all fake. Again, that's a discussion that I would love to take time to go into. But suffice it to say that, for example, if you go back to uh, the book of Exodus and you see the magicians of Pharaoh there, um, let's just take one particular so-called magic trick that they performed, and that is that Moses took his rod and threw it down on the ground and it became a serpent. Uh, the magicians of Pharaoh supposedly did that also. Okay? Well, there's two things I would say to that. Number one is the idea that we have found in Egyptian literature we have found instructions of where you take a cobra, and if you catch it and you hold it at the right place on the back of the neck, just at the nape of the neck, somewhere probably below the hood area, the cobra becomes stiff. It becomes rigid. I don't know how rigid, to what extent it becomes stiff. Does it become completely stiff? I don't know. But the idea is that there are instructions that would have been found within um, Egyptian literature that tells them how to do that. And then if you release the snake, then it goes back to what it was before, acting like a snake, being kind of fluid in its movements and so forth. Well, the second thing we would add to that, or that we would say against the idea of the Egyptians having the power to take a piece of wood, an inanimate object, and turn it into a live object, is the fact that if we're going to say that they had the power to do that, then I guess my next question would be, from where did that power come? God is certainly not going to give them the power to do exactly what Moses did in order to fool people. So the only thing that we could say is that the power that they had came from Satan. If in fact they had this power, it had to have come from Satan. All right. If we admit that idea, then the next question would be, are we willing to give Satan the power over life? That Satan has the power to create life. That would have to be the case. If you take an inanimate object, a piece of wood, a staff, and turn it into an animate object, a living being, you have to have the powers of creation. You have to have the power over life and death and that kind of thing. And does Satan have the power of life? No. So if we say that the Egyptian magicians had the power and actually did turn a piece of wood into a snake, then we have to say that they had power over life. And I'm not willing to admit that. I'm not willing to admit that at all. It goes against everything taught in the Scriptures. God is the only one who has the power of life and death. That is, he has the power of life. Satan brought sin and death into this world as a consequence of his temptation of Eve and so forth, Eve and Adam. But and the last enemy that will be defeated is death, defeated by Christ at the last day. So in some respects, Satan has some power in the realm of death and so forth, but certainly not life. Okay. So I believe we can prove that these magicians, whether they be Egyptian magicians or Babylonian magicians, I believe we can prove that they are wrong, that they are fakes. Is a better way to put that. What about the next group of people? The New American Standard says conjurers. Other translations say enchanters or astrologers. This consisted of a body of persons who sought to influence others by charms and other such mediums. They demonstrated their powers through the means of charming snakes and fowl, birds, and other animals. I guess if they could train a bird to speak or an animal to do certain things or a snake to do certain things, then they might sway somebody to listen to them. The next category of persons that are listed are the sorcerers. The sorcerers made a practice of consulting the mysterious, whether animals, human, divine, supposed divine powers, in order to determine a future course of action. So they were more into the spirit world, so to speak. And then finally, you have the category known as the Chaldeans, which some translations say master astrologers. Let's see what other translations we have. Astrologers. So I guess that's about it. Chaldeans and astrologers. What are these? Well, these would have been people taught in the Babylonian temple school. They consisted of those who had learning in the fields of astronomy, mathematics, and the associated theories of astrology and divination. These are the type of people, maybe along with some of these others, who would take an animal, and like a chicken or some other animal, and kill it, and then study the entrails, the guts of the animal, in order to come up with a prophecy, or like if there is a decision that the king wants to make, like should I go to war against this nation, or should I build this building, this temple, these different things, or whatever. Supposedly these men would take the animals or animal, and they would, like I say, a chicken, they would kill it and spread its entrails across the table and say, according to the way this is here and that is there, then yes, you should go to war against this nation, or you should build this temple, or you should do whatever. Or if if the so-called divination came to a negative conclusion, they would say, no, you shouldn't do this. But again, as I said of these other people, these people, if they were politically minded, if they were of a bent of attitude or of ideas that were against the king, then they would do everything they could using these methods to take his power away, to dethrone him, to they would advise him to do something that would be harmful to him or harmful to his reign as king. Or if they wanted him to do something for them that would favor them somehow, then they would give him advice to do this. They were basically charlatans that at times became greedy for their power and their influence, and they used that power and influence to direct the affairs of the kingdom from behind the scenes. Now, we talk about all these people, the magicians, the enchanters, the sorcerers, the Chaldeans. What does the Bible say? We've already mentioned the idea that we believe these people to be fake, that they don't have any real power. But what is it that the Bible says about this type of thing? In Deuteronomy 18, beginning in verse 9, verses 9 through 12, it says this: When you enter the land which the Lord your God gives you, you shall not learn to imitate the detestable things of those nations. There shall not be found among you anyone who makes his son or his daughter pass through the fire, one who uses divination, one who practices witchcraft, or one who interprets omens, or a sorcerer, or one who casts a spell, or a medium, or a spiritist, or one who calls up the dead. For whoever does these things is detestable to the Lord, and because of these detestable things, the Lord your God will drive them out before you. Now, some people look at this passage and they say, well, if there were some people who didn't have these powers, why would God forbid the people to take part in these things? That is to say, let me rephrase that. There were, based on this passage, people say that there were people who had these powers. And because they dealt with things that, over the years, these things have become associated with Satan and satanic powers and so forth. So therefore, you can see why God would prohibit his people from doing them. But again, what I'm trying to say is that some people look at this passage and they say, well, obviously there were some people who could do these things, and therefore God is forbidding them based on the fact that he doesn't want anybody to have, any of his people to have anything to do with them, based on the idea that they are associated with Satan and sin and death and so forth. Well, my answer to that idea, that there were actually people who did those things, my answer would be that I don't believe that's what this passage is saying. I believe what this passage is saying is that don't take part in these things, number one, because they have association with evil and so forth, but number two, because they don't exist. They simply don't. They're not. They're not real. And to make people think that they're real is to deceive them. Okay? Somebody may point to the situation there at the end of 2 Samuel with Saul and the witch of Endor, or the medium of Endor. My answer to that is look at the passage and see who was surprised. Who was the one who was surprised? If you go over and read that passage, let's see if we can find it real quick. And 2 Samuel, let's see. I'm sorry, that's 1 Samuel. Should be 1 Samuel. Get down here to the end of the chapter. This would be 1 Samuel chapter 28. 1 Samuel chapter 28. If you go down to verse well, let's just start reading in verse 8. 1 Samuel 28:8. Then Saul disguised himself by putting on their other clothes, and went, he and 2 men with him, and they came to the woman by night. And he said, Conjure up for me, please, and bring up for me whom I shall name to you. But the woman said to him, Behold, you know that what Saul has done, how he has cut off those who are mediums and spiritists from the land. Why are you then laying a snare for my life to bring about my death? Saul vowed to her by the Lord, saying, As the Lord lives, no punishment shall come upon you for this thing. Then the woman said, Whom shall I bring up for you? And he said, Bring up Samuel for me. When the woman saw Samuel, she cried out with a loud voice. And the woman spoke to Saul, saying, Why have you deceived me, for you are Saul? The king said to her, Do not be afraid, but what do you see? And the woman said to Saul, I see a divine being come up out of the earth. He said to her, What is his form? And he said, An old man is coming up, and he is wrapped with a robe. And Saul knew that it was Samuel, and he bowed with his face to the ground and did homage. Well, what we want to call attention to is found in verse 12. When the woman saw Samuel, she cried out with a loud voice. Why did she do that? I believe she did it because she didn't expect him to come up. She did not expect him to actually rise from the dead here. Not physically rise from the dead, but his spirit come back from the dead. She didn't expect it because she knew that that any other time she had done it, it never happened. That is, she fooled people. I mean, even now, even in this instance, when Samuel actually came up from the dead, Saul didn't see him. Only the witch of Endor saw him. Only the woman saw him. So the idea is that if that is the case for every other time that she did this for people, I would say fooled people, then all she had to say was, I can see him, but you can't, kind of thing, and let me tell you what he's saying. Well, all you have to do is claim that you're seeing a spirit and just make up whatever you want to make up. But she's the one that cries out with a loud voice. She's the one that is surprised. Now, I'm going to admit that I could be wrong in my understanding of this passage, but this is what I think is happening here. And I think that's what happens whenever a magician, a sorcerer, or whatever is described in the Scriptures. The most famous one would be in in Acts chapter 8, I believe it is, where Simon the sorcerer hears the gospel and is baptized. Let's just run over there real quick, and I will leave this subject. But one thing that is telling, I think, about this particular passage is that starting in verse 9 of Acts chapter 8, it says, Now there was a man named Simon who formerly was practicing magic in the city and astonishing the people of Samaria, claiming to be someone great. There you have the word claiming, okay? You have the word claiming, which he was saying, literally, The word is saying that he was someone great, claiming to be someone great. And they all, from smallest to greatest, were giving attention to him, saying, "This man is what is called the great power of God." So he's claiming to be someone great. He's doing things to make people think that he has these powers to do something great. Now look at verse 11. And they were giving him attention because he had for a long time astonished them with his magic arts. The word, well, let's just go on to the following verses. It says, verse 12, but when they believed Philip preaching the good news about the kingdom of God in the name of Jesus Christ, they were being baptized, men and women alike. Even Simon himself believed, and after being baptized, he continued on with Philip, and as he observed signs and great miracles taking place, he was constantly amazed. Now, first we had the thing in verse 9 where it says he was claiming to be someone great. He was saying, "I'm someone great." Number 2, in verse 10, the people were calling him the great power of God. That doesn't mean he was the great power of God. They were calling him the great power of God. Verse 11, he was astonishing them. Now here's where I want to tie in to verse 13. In verse 11, he had for a long time astonished them with his magic arts. And then, in verse 13, after he's baptized, he observes the signs of the great miracles taking place, and he was constantly amazed. The person who formerly astonished others is himself astonished. He's the one who is amazed. Now, if he had some type of power, if he had the ability to work miracles, magic, whatever you call it, okay, if he had the ability to do that, then when he sees Peter and John, when he sees Philip doing these things, why is he not saying, "I can do that"? Well, that's nothing. Why are you, what are you trying to prove here, Philip? I can do that. Just give me a minute. Let me go over here and find somebody, and I'll heal them of what they have. I'll help this lame man. I'll help this blind man. I'll bring back their ability to walk or their ability to see. That's nothing. What else you got? But no, he was the one who was astonishing people. Philip comes on the scene, and he himself is now astonished. Why? Because he's a fake. He's a fake. He pulls rabbits out of hats. I don't know how close you've ever been to a magician, but I've been near them, and I've seen where the hat has a false bottom, or I've been shown a few magic tricks where you have a box that's got something in it, and then all of a sudden when you close the lid, a mirror falls down somehow. A mirror is placed in there, and when you open it up, all it's showing is the back of the box or the top of the box or whatever. And then shows there's nothing in the box, but in reality, whatever it was is behind the mirror or behind the glass or whatever it was. I don't remember all the details, but these magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, sorcerers, they're all fake, in my understanding. All right, verse 4 of Daniel chapter 2. Let me get back to that. All right, verse 4 says, Then the Chaldeans spoke to the king in Aramaic. This is where the text, as we said earlier, chapter 2, verse 4, I believe through chapter 7, I guess it was 7:28. I forget exactly the specific verse references, but this is where the text turns over to being in Aramaic instead of Hebrew. Then the Chaldeans spoke to the king in Aramaic, O king, live forever. Tell the dream to your servants, and we will declare the interpretation. Some say that the Aramaic was considered the court language. I would agree with that. The idea that Aramaic would have been the language of diplomacy, the language that the king would communicate in with his advisors, because it would have been the language that was understood throughout the empire, and that has been proven. But it's kind of like, I guess you could say, it's kind of like English is the international language today. I believe that is probably going to change in the next few decades, but this would be like English being the international language. Aramaic was the international language of that time. Now, one thing we note here from verse 4 also is the fact that the Chaldeans speak to the king, and they say, O king, live forever. Tell the dream to your servants, and we will declare the interpretation. Well, as we'll see in Nebuchadnezzar's reply to them, he wants them to tell him the dream. Number one, he's forgotten it. But number two, it's a good test of your advisors. Even if he knew the dream, it's a good test of your advisors to see whether they're telling the truth or not. Okay? So I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought there for a second. The idea is that this verse just proves that these people don't have the power that they claim to have, and therefore just proves that they're fake. All right, verses 5 and 6. The king replied to the Chaldeans, the command from me is firm. If you do not make known to me the dream and its interpretation, you will be torn limb from limb, and your houses will be made a rubbish heap. But if you declare the dream and its interpretation, you will receive from me gifts and a reward and great honor. Therefore declare to me the dream and its interpretation. First, we have the warning of punishment if they could not tell the king his dream and its meaning, and then the promise of reward to the one or ones that could tell and explain the king's dream. Now, the king labeled his so-called wise men as speakers of lying and corrupt words if they would not tell him the dream. So, or at least he will, I'm sorry, down in verse 9. All right, verses 7 and following we'll discuss in the next session, since we're almost out of time here in our 1 hour time frame. We'll stop here and pick up with verses 7 through 11. And as always, if you have questions, please let me know. Thank you.